now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. So when we went to commercial break, I ran down real quick because I heard that my mail was in, and woohoo, got the book. My new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, just got the proof copy in. I haven't really looked at it yet because I've been a little busy hanging out with all of you. But it's here. It's almost time to be released. But there's an announcement that I need to make that I forgot to make in the first hour of the show. And that is that Just Energy Radio is moving to a new network. And so starting on October 19th, we will no longer be on Blog Talk Radio. We will now be on Inception Radio Network. And for the people that listen to me regular, there will be an engineer to take care of all the electronic stuff like muting the mic and calling people up and important things like that seem to plague me regularly. Anyway, so that is going to start on October 19th. I'm very excited. One of the things that's cool about this new network is that they have an app that you can download, so you can listen to it, on your iPhone or Android phone, and as well as their network is on TuneIn Radio, so you can listen to their programming 24/7, including me. How good is that? Anyway, don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. So let me tell you a little bit about our next guest. Her name is Normandi Ellis, and we're going to be talking about imagining our world into existence. Normandi Ellis is the author of 10 books. Her translations from the Egyptian hieroglyphs, Awakening Osiris, is a spiritual classic. Past president of the National Association of Poetry Therapy Foundation. In 2011, she co-published Invoking the Scribes of Ancient Egypt, a text on how to write spiritual autobiography. In July 2012, Bayer & Company published Imagining the World into Existence, her treatise on expanding states of consciousness. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio the author of Imagining the World into Existence, Normandi Ellis. Hey, Normandi, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Nice to be here with you.
It's nice to be here with you, too. And I just have to tell the listeners, we're communicating via Skype, and I'm like watching you on my computer, which is a little weird, but it's good. So, Normandi, how did you become interested in Egypt cosmology and even in the ability to read hieroglyphics?
Well, it started actually in, it's a very long story, but part of the story, I'll condense it, was that I was in graduate school getting a master's in English. I was studying fiction writing, creative writing, but I was doing works in translation. And we worked in Spanish for a while, and then I was told we needed to switch to our other language, and other than Southern Kentucky, I have no other language than Spanish. So he said, well, what would you like to learn? And a friend of mine had given me a book of Wallace Budge, which had the hieroglyphic text in it. So it was kind of like his translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And I got various copies of other people's translations. I got some good grammar dictionaries, and I just started playing with it. It was a class project that lasted about 10 years. And I translated that book from beginning to end 3 times because I was fascinated with a language that was also symbolic in terms of it had sound, and the hieroglyphs were connected to sound, but they were also connected to symbols that were used in combinations that I found particularly fascinating. And so I began to study it that way. And then, sort of after 10 years, my husband thought it was obsessive, so he thought I should throw it away. And I was doing that. But on the way to throw it away, the man who had told me very first to read the Egyptian Book of the Dead Robert Weiler had died, and the year after he gave me the book. So I was throwing away all these texts and everything that I'd been working on that he had given me. And as I'm driving to the dumpster, his spirit appears in the back of my car and stayed my hand, so to speak. And so I went back and published. And it was about 2 months after I finished the last version of the translation that a publisher came and asked me if I had a book, and I did. So I really owe it to a spirit.
You went to a spirit?
Yeah, I guess I owe it to a spirit who really kept me from throwing away all the work I had done.
Well, you wouldn't be the first person on this show that has attributed things to spirits, spirit guides, gods, ghosts.
Well, the other thing
we take any kind of non-corporeal being on the show.
Right, but it was 10 years of research.
But that's pretty amazing. I mean, I joke around that English is my first language, and it's the only one I know. And so I just, give you, kudos for taking on something like hieroglyphics, where there really isn't a whole lot of context to work in. I mean, it's kind of like taking on cuneiform. No one speaks it. No one really knows what the sounds are.
Right. That is problematic, that no one knows what the sounds are. But the sound was really important in the hieroglyphic language, as it is in Hebrew language. So the flame alphabet, where the vowel and the breath sounds are written above the alphabet. The Egyptians had the same idea. And so many of the texts, we just have a lot of ease in it because we don't really know what the breathy vocal vowels were, but they were the invocation part of the language.
So kind of like they say that the vowels are the spirit of the language. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, that's what I'm getting at.
But that's, I don't think people look at hieroglyphics in that way. It's kind of interesting because there's a belief that they had this religious culture there, but then it's kind of like really separated from everything else that they have found in Egypt.
Well, the religious culture was very much a part of the Egyptian culture. I mean, they spent, in terms of how long that culture lasted, over 3,000 years. I mean, I don't know of a culture that has lasted any longer than that, really. And a lot of it is reconstructed based on spiritual texts that we have found called the Book of the Dead, that we find in tombs or we find written on walls. Granted, they wrote in a different language called hieroglyphics for business purposes, but only the high priests wrote in hieroglyphs. And those were what was written on the temple walls and in the tombs. So it really was a spiritual culture, and the most literate people were the religious people.
That's interesting. I never knew that there was a separation of, I don't want to say language, but of script between the priest and the, elite probably, and the everyday working man.
Right. Well, in the early dynasties, the everyday working man was pretty much illiterate, and the glyphs themselves were not pictures. You know how you see pictures of some pharaoh's tomb, and you have like someone standing in front of a god and he's holding these jars, and he's doing these funny things with his fingers. None of that is in the true hieroglyph. In the true hieroglyph, in the very first religious text, it is simply the language in hieroglyphs written on the wall. There's no illustration, there's nothing else, and only the priests knew how to read that, and the scribes who wrote it.
And it brings up a really kind of interesting question. If no one could read it, then why would they cover monuments or obelisks with this language that no one understood? I mean, it's beautiful, but...
Well, I wouldn't say no one understood it. Those who understood it. And those who didn't were fairly confident that there was someone who understood it, and they could go and get someone to explain it to them if they were in a position. But they pretty much, I guess you could say, held their cards close to their chest. You know, they did not want other cultures coming in and mucking around with their religious and spiritual traditions. And it was a way of preserving it, that no one from the outside would be able to come in and read it. Greeks were constantly coming over to Egypt asking to be taught in the temples, and they were turned away. And there's like this wonderful story about Pythagorean coming over to Egypt, and he was there for 30 years. And he would go, you know, he had a letter from the Pharaoh that said, go to this temple and study with these priests. And the priest looked at it and said, well, you know, you really don't want to know what we know. You want to know what these priests over here know. So they sent him like all the way up the Nile to another temple. And those priests said, well, I don't know, you know, it doesn't seem like we're the ones to give you the information. You need to go down here, you know, so sail back down the Nile. And he traveled around for 30 years. Basically, he just walked among the stones and said, I want to read them. I want to read them. So the priest finally at one temple took him in and gave him ridiculous tasks to do, all of which he did very willingly because he wanted to prove that he wanted to learn how to do this. So eventually they saw that he was serious, and he had this letter from the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh said, you know, this guy really deserves a shot. So they taught him what they knew about numbers. And everything that we know about numbers, because we consider Pythagoras the father of mathematics, the Greek father of mathematics. And he will say, everything I learned in Egypt. You know, so that's kind of one of those interesting stories about protecting, you know, the sacred knowledge, because it really was considered the sacred knowledge.
But you find that in cultures worldwide when you're talking about the spiritual tradition and that kind of level. But I have to make one commentary about Pythagoras. I think it's kind of bad that he got the credit for the Pythagorean Theorem and everyone's going to remember him. And basically he took something that someone else said and he made it mainstream.
Yeah, and it has his name on it. But
yeah.
there were no, really, other than Imhotep, there were no high priests, you know, who put their names on things. Very few did that. It was mostly the gods who were doing the work through the people, and that was what was acknowledged.
One of the things that you talk about, and I'm always interested in hearing, is like creation stories. And one of the probably most complicated one that I've encountered is the Egyptian one. And so I was wondering if you could, for the listeners, you know, they came from somewhere, or there is a belief that they came from somewhere, and sharing, you know, their creation story, their cosmology.
Well, the Egyptians had several creation stories, which is what makes it so fascinating, because they envisioned our creativity in a number of different ways. One of the major ways was through a god whose name was Ptah, and his hieroglyph actually is a hieroglyph with a pair of lips that has like fluid coming out of it. It's like someone would go patoo, you know. But his hieroglyph says that he spoke the world into being, and what he spoke came from his heart. And what came from the heart and tongue of Ptah was what we know of as Ma'at, or truth, which is the foundation of everything. You know, the feather of Ma'at is what is held in the balance against the heart in the underworld, and that truth is weighed against one's heart. So Ptah speaks the world into being. That's one way. There's another god who also speaks the world into being, and his name is Atum. A-T-U-M is how it's written. It probably, because it's got a lot of vowels in it, it's probably closer to an oming sound. But Atum his name means everything and nothingness, or the Greeks later took his name and made it into Atom, Atom, and he was like the whirling emptiness that then had a desire for something other than nothingness and spoke a word and light sprang from his lips, and that was Ra. And so Atum created light, the light vibration, and then that parts the waters, which were called the Nun, or the nothingness. And then from that arose a mound of earth, and on it was a phoenix. And the phoenix was, of course, the beginning and is also the end. So it's representative of the cycle of nature and time. And the flood, again, is important in Egyptian constructs because when the Nile floods, it basically obliterates and covers everything. And then as it recedes, the fertile black earth is revealed in, mounds of earth here and there. I think Elephantine would be a good example of how the waters recede, leaving, lots of mud layers to dig through. And that was every year around the same time, usually July or early August, when the dog star Sirius rose. And so it was rather predictable, this end of the world and the beginning of the world. So that's one story. That's another story. There are other stories about the goddess Neith, who created the world. She's like the great-grandmother, equivalent to the Spider Woman stories of the Native Americans. And she is a weaver, and she is nothing except the body of Nun, which is the water sloshing back and forth. And it's like threads. Have you ever watched the water with the sunlight on it, and it looks woven? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like the way the water goes back and forth. So those are the threads of her robe that she wears. And then she reaches in to herself and she pulls out fishes, and then she pulls out crocodiles, and she pulls out birds, and she pulls out plants, and she pulls out people, and so on and so on. And so everything is born from her body, from the body of this great mother, who's sometimes called Neith, sometimes Nut, the sky goddess, which you might have heard of. They're very similar in orientation. So those are just three of the myths. And you're right, they're complicated.
Well, they're complicated, and there's 500 different gods doing all kinds of things, and keeping track of who's who and what's what is challenging.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, it's 3,000 years. We don't have nearly that long of keeping track, of our religious tradition. But we certainly have a lot of traditions that overlap and are similar sometimes in different ways, though they come from different cultures. I think the Egyptians just, kept it all in one spot, but had multiple versions for other people who could, understand it, as a god who made people out of clay. There's another one.
Mm-hmm.
Gee, that sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Just a bit. Just a bit. How does, they were a very spiritual group, and how does their cosmology, fit into spirituality? There's that axiom, so above, also below. And so if there is this stuff happening, in the physical world, is it also happening in the spiritual world? So is there ties and parallels between these myths that come down to us about physical creation that also...
Yeah, I think I see what you're asking. And the way I would answer that is to say that to the Egyptians, the gods and goddesses were visible aspects of spirituality, particularly visible in the world. That's why you see so many crocodile gods or hawk gods or cow goddesses. It was like the qualities of this particular animal, the quality of the cow, which, was full of milk, which nourished not only the calves, its own children, but could be used to nourish all of the children of Egypt. A good cow was pretty important. But that's an aspect of the divine that nourishes us. And so it's kind of like we're seeing, we think of myths as fairy tales or stories, but really it's more like seeing a parable or seeing a symbol or truly seeing God alive in nature. I would say that would be what they looked at. In fact, they called their divine beings NTR, which we call Neter or Nature. The Coptic Christians, when they pray to God, they say Nature, and the Greeks picked that up as the word nature. So it is connected to, the world. And I'm thinking about, Meister Eckhart. I think he was like a 13th or 14th century Christian mystic. And he said this wonderful thing. He said, apprehend God in all things, for God is in all things. Every single creature is filled with God and is a book about God. So I think that's kind of a nice idea, to think that all of nature is a book about God. And if we thought that way, we would certainly treat our bodies, our environment, completely different if we thought that it was a spiritual being we were messing with. Right?
But it wouldn't even be a being. It would be we were part of that being, and, this chair is part of that being, and the plant is part of that being, and it's like cutting your toe off by if we're part of God.
So it is. That's right, and so it is.
But we just have such a separation, like God's there and we're here, and never the twain shall meet.
Right. Right. And I think that really is at the heart, that idea of our separateness from God is at the heart of all of the unkind and unloving things that we do to the world and to each other.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that people had that kind of relationship with God in that time? And let me rephrase that, because that's not where I want to go. In our current society, we are taught that you need to go to an intermediate, you need to go to your priest, you need to go to your rabbi, you need to go to your guru to get guidance and advice on how to live a holy life. Do you think it was like that in ancient Egypt, or do you think that they had a closer connection or a better understanding of the divine?
I think that they had a better understanding of the divine. There were very few family houses that were without, even in the kitchen, a statue that would, promote ideas of nurturing, or the god Bes, who was the god of children and joy. Almost every household had a little niche in the wall, and there was a statue of that. He also chased away bad dreams. And to tell you the truth, when my daughter was young, I had gotten a little statue of Bes in Egypt, and she had a bad dream, and I put him next to her bed and said, okay, he's going to take care of it. He'll just take it away. And, she didn't have any bad dreams after that.
And so, Bes is the cat, correct?
Bes is a little, Bast is the cat, and she's the nurturing goddess, the cat goddess of the house. And you definitely wanted a cat in your house because you had to keep the vermin out of the grain. But Bes is a little African pygmy god who sometimes has his tongue pressed between his teeth like this, and he's going he like birth. He's a birthing god as well, and he's kind of like a Lamaze method of birthing. Pretty interesting.
When you look at their spirituality, do you think it's still relevant today?
Well, I do, because I happen to see. I mean, people say, well, what do you believe about that? And I go to an Episcopal church, and when people ask me about my thoughts on Egyptian stuff, I laugh and I say, well, I'm an Episcopalian. But the truth of the matter is, I see God in all things, and I do not see that there is any reason to separate that. I mean, you can tell I feel very strongly about that. I get up every morning and I say a prayer. Sometimes it's one that I learned from my childhood church, and sometimes it's an Egyptian prayer. that I pray. And there are a number of different ways that I like to pray in different ways, not the same way all the time. But I think that daily life, understanding that we're all part of that light vibration, first thing in the morning and last thing when you close your eyes, it makes me go through my life unafraid, and I think that that's really key. And I don't care what age you live in, that's a good way to live.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, the more that you communicate with or check in with God, the stronger that relationship can be. Right.
And it's a full body experience,
Mm-hmm.
It should be.
I'm going to kind of change gears here. One of the things that I always found very interesting that has come out of Egypt are some of their medical texts.
Right.
And they have this is what the person has, and then this is what you do about it. And correct me if I'm wrong, when they would address things, and not necessarily just medical things, but they would address things on a physical level, like apply honey over the surface, and, which is great as an antibacterial, antimicrobial. But then they would incorporate, ritual and magic into it. Did you find that in your looking at other areas of their culture?
I think that that's a good point. And I think that the combination of ritual or magic in conjunction with a kind of pharmaceutical understanding of how the body works and what herbs it responds to, or what to do about particular, injured parts of the body. A lot of that they learned, from building pyramids, and someone, a big rock falls on them, and it's like, okay, you have this on your head. If you have blood in your ear, it means this, If you are not seeing, straight, it means this, And they would say things like, go to bed and wait 2 days and then see how it is. Or they would say things like, do nothing, So it was like, well, it was going to be a wait and see, because there wasn't a whole lot you could do about that one. But they had from the top of your head down to your feet, everything that could possibly happen to you, done during the Third Dynasty, written by Imhotep when he was building the Step Pyramid.
And so about when was that dated to?
Oh, like 2600 BC. So, and he was like the Leonardo da Vinci of Egypt. He was not a pharaoh, although he actually in later times attained the stature of a god because he was so powerful. He was an architect, he was the chief wizard, he was a physician, and he was a high priest and scribe. So, he was a fairly important guy. And during that period of time, especially in the Old Kingdom, they had women physicians. And that was really, you don't see a lot of that in other cultures, but there are tombs in Saqqara of female physicians. And many of them, some of them just dealt with gynecological stuff, but others of them did the whole range, And any time a woman was giving birth, she had, a birthing coach. She had several women to support her. And they had methods of, early pregnancy tests, which I find kind of fascinating, depending on whether the urine in emmer, which is a wheat, or barley grows first. It has to do with whether there's estrogen or progesterone in your urine. And so not only could they tell was a woman pregnant, they could tell the sex of the baby. I think that's really fascinating.
And then we had to wait, 5,000 years to have that same technology. And
right.
There were no animal tests involved back then.
That's right. No rabbits had to die in the process. Right?
One of the things that you said, if Imhotep was responsible, for all of this medical knowledge, or, kind of started documenting it, let's say, there had to have been a long tradition of medicine up until the point, where it's not like he just said, oh, well, I mean, he could have been a medical intuitive and could have just said, well, this is what I see in you, and this is, kind of like an Edgar Cayce thing, which I doubt.
Well,
and people don't really realize that, when Egypt came into being, there was already this long history of development.
Well, that's true. And we don't know because we don't have written records that go any further back than the records that we do have. We do know that the hieroglyphs appear full-blown in stone, but I suspect that they were being written on papyrus, 3,000, 4,000 BC, but the papyrus is gone now. And, of course, way before the very first pharaoh of Egypt were rulers who were called the Shemsu Hor, or the followers of Horus, and supposedly there were 40,000 years of those guys. So who they were, I don't know, but I like speculating on them. There are many books written on whether or not they are extraterrestrial or whether they came from Atlantis, but there is a long history of people who came before the very first pharaoh, and they did bring that kind of knowledge with them.
So you believe that they brought some kind of advanced culture, advanced technology with them to Egypt?
I think people were a lot smarter than we give them credit for. Yeah. And over a process of time, things were figured out. Maybe they were given to us. That's an area I can't really go into because I don't really know, but I like speculating about it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I believe is that cultures that were in existence at that point in time had a deeper understanding of, one, our place in the cosmos, as well as a deeper understanding of energy and, our multidimensional nature in the universe that we are just now rediscovering.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, for example, they knew all about the movement of the heavens, the stars, the planning, the clocks that they used were the sky. They could tell during a particular season when it was an hour before daylight because of the way a star was hanging in, someone's ear as they were sitting on the roof of a temple. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There are things that we don't even think they knew about that they must have known for thousands and thousands of years because they were paying attention to the energy in the universe.
But it also goes into the area, and I'm going to just jump back to medicine as an example. Today, one of the big things is like, oh, well, I got energy work done, or I'm doing alternative healing. But when you read their texts, that's all it is they're doing a little bit of work on the physical and then using energy, intention, ritual to promote healing, which in my mind, it's energy work. Right.
And that energy, I believe, is primarily mental. It begins in the mental realm. As Louise Hay would be the first to tell us, thoughts are things. And sometimes those things can get stuck in our bodies, and we just need to take the thought to move it out. Sometimes needs a little help, so an herb or a laxative or whatever can help get that thing moving out. A lot of the things you hear about, like Egyptians, they would write in hieroglyphs, in a particular kind of ink, special ink on someone's arm, a spell for getting well, and then they'd have that person lick it off. Now, I know that sounds a little nutty, but just imagine if you had a headache and you had written on it with juice from a willow bark, and then you lick it off. You're basically taking aspirin,
Yeah.
So it's in a way, yes, in my thoughts, I am thinking this is going to work and this is going to make it go away. And it does help remove it. If I am convinced there's nothing going to cure my headache, nothing will cure my headache because it's here. There is something that needs me to be sick, to lie down, So I think it works both ways. And I think you're right. Energy is thought.
Well, I mean, I do energy work, and, my biggest fan is my husband, because he used to get headaches, and finally, I'll say fairly recently married, early in the relationship, he was thought it was just all this woo-woo hocus-pocus stuff that he was not in agreement to. He'll just go take more aspirin. And so finally one day he decided to let me work on him. And when I work, and if you go to my webpage, anyone that's listening, you can click on the little video of energy medicine, and my hands wave around, and I yawn a lot, my eyes water, and then my nose starts to run, but what I'm doing is looking in his body and using my energy and intention and visualization. I'm cracking, doing a chiropractic adjustment on his back, clearing out his liver, doing these manipulations, but I'm sitting in my chair, he's sitting in his chair, and I'm doing all this stuff, and after about 10 minutes, I'll ask him, so how do you feel? He'd be like, better. Wait, placebo effect.
No. Not at all. No, I believe that energy, when you're moving energy around, you drop a pebble into the water and it's going to create waves. And so any action is moving toward some sort of resolution, and all our bodies are just vibrating. We're just vibrating all the time. So, all the atoms. And I do think that energy work, the ancient Egyptians were doing that. They were doing Reiki. They were doing reflexology. You can see pictures in some of the tombs of people performing Reiki. A lot of the temple walls, you'll see Reiki movements. You'll see in the shrines of Tutankhamun, you'll see images of energy waves coming from cobras spitting energy forms into the third eye and, into the crown chakra, into the throat chakra, into the solar plexus, and so that they knew what those energy waves were doing, because they picked the right areas to move, to show you how the energy was moving. So it's fascinating.
I remember giving a presentation talking about energy and energy medicine, and how quantum physics has finally gotten to the point where they recognize that we're energy vibrating and we have chakras, or whatever words they want to use. And my comment was, you could go down to the metaphysical bookstore and learn all about it.
Right.
When you look, because I know you have looked through some of these texts very thoroughly, and can you compare them or with things that are coming out of, and I'm going to say the New Age movement just because I don't have a better reference point, as far as similarities in base thoughts or even techniques? You brought up reflexology and Reiki, but do you see more parallels? Maybe different words, but it's really the same?
Yes, I am seeing things that are very much the same. I'm seeing things in astrology. I'm seeing things in Kabbalah. I'm seeing things in energy work and medicine. I'm seeing a lot of what we would think of as natural law. It's like New Age thought. But natural law is very prominent in Egyptian spiritual work. And if you read the text, you can find places where you understand that's what they're talking about. That they're talking about the law of mind. They're talking about, oppositions. They're talking about the law of environment, of polarity, all of these things. That's what you're seeing. You look at the way they, I thought it was pretty interesting when I was comparing the shrines of Tutankhamun and the way that all of the shrines were nested inside each other. There was the 3 great big shrines with a veil in between them, and then 4 other boxes, and then you get down to the mummy level, and they're all these nested boxes. And I looked at it and I said, that's a Tesla coil. You know, it was like a charged couple device that I used to see when I worked at Ball Airspace. You know, how the same thing that is the construct of how energy moves around and is now able to show us Hubble Space Telescope images was the same thing that they were using to preserve the energy inside these tombs. You know, the pharaohs, when they died, they were kept there with the prayers and the energy and the spoken words, and everything was like a memory vault in a way.
You know, I never thought about the coffin being in the coffin being in the coffin being a coffin. You know, and what it brings to my mind, just that kind of little visualization, is, you know, a representation of the different energy bodies. You know, there's the physical body inside the astral body, inside the, you know,
yes,
blah, 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 blah.
Yes, exactly.
I'm pretty smart on this end.
Yeah, that's it.
But, you know, I've never even thought to look at it from that perspective, and that's like, you know, ooh, I'm having a little light bulb moment. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and, you know, to think then that's the way they saw it. That's the way it was to them. It was very obvious that was how it was working. You know, and that even though this physical form was passing away, there were forms, you know, levels on which that life was still participating.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely, you know, I don't want to say they believed in ghosts, but they definitely had a belief in life after death and the preservation of the soul.
Mm-hmm. They did.
You know, we're talking about death, and let's talk about the Book of the Dead for a second. You know, since you've translated it 3 times.
Great.
You know, let me just put my comment, and then you can go wherever you want. You know, I've read it. I'm one of those weird people that read books like that for fun. And when I read it, it almost seemed more like, you're going to laugh, it seemed more like a walkthrough on a video game as opposed to a book that is supposed to help you transcend consciousness. And I would just like to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I think that that's a valid comment, which is why it took me 10 years and 3 times through it to try to translate it. Because any time that you looked at that text and you tried to give an equivalent word for word translation, you would miss about 90% of what was in the text. Because, as we said, it worked on sounds, and it worked on homophones, it worked on sort of like punning language, and then there were all the symbols that were embedded in it, and then there was all the mythology that was behind the symbol. So let me just give you little brief examples. So you have this text, which is about, actually, we're going back to the creation myth, which we as the dead are participating in. So we're going to say these words in which the world was remade so that we can remake ourselves, okay? And so the line has a bunch of hieroglyphs that are just little dung beetles, and they're just repeated over and over and over with a couple of little sounds in between them. And if you just listened to the sound of it, it would sound like Nukpu im kepara kepare keparu Nukpu im rea. And basically, line for line, it's just dung beetle being, dung beetle being, dung beetle being. But what it really meant was words like becoming used the dung beetle, being used the dung beetle, transformation used the dung beetle, all concepts of time and cycle. So when I translated it, I took that line and I made it say what I thought it meant, which was, in the beginning, I became the becoming, being what I created. So that makes it different than just a bunch of dung beetles that just say existence, 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 which is the way Budge translated it.
But when you read that book, one of the things that is very evident is that the deceased is taking on the role of the god, or, trying to sneak through the underworld as the god. It's his avatar. And, and I could see, based on what you're saying, this might be like an affirmation for that person to take on that persona.
Yeah, well, it was that the recognition that that person, being a part of the natural world, was a God seed. And so, as a God seed, was able to make that transition and that transformation in the same way that all other great God seeds would have done. Yes, avatar, you can think of it that way, but I prefer to think of it as, he recognized the God in himself, and then he made his changes accordingly.
Okay.
Yeah.
What happened to people that, don't make it through the whole thing? Some serpent chews them up, or they get to the end, thank God, and they're on that last level, and then their heart weighs more than that feather.
Right. What
happens to them? Do they have to go back to the next level and try again? Sorry, I'm making these video game analogies, but
no, that's okay. If you really didn't get it, I think the Egyptians had this concept that there were do-overs. When you go down into a tomb and you come back up, especially in the pyramid tomb of Unas, and you're reading on the script on the wall, it's like coming up through a birth canal, and you suddenly oh, I get it, I'm being reborn. I'm not reading this going into the tomb, I'm reading it coming out of the tomb, and so all of the texts are birthing texts. They're all about recreation. They're all about coming out. And one way has you come out and you can go up to live in the stars forever with the eternal spirits, concept of heaven. The other way is you can come out and be form again, essentially. You can take form again, so that you're given on these walls the idea of two paths that you can choose. Granted, there are some things where it's just, such that if the crocodile eats your heart, then it will be as if you had never existed. So that's reserved for pretty bad people. Let's hope it's reserved for somebody like a Hitler, that we don't have to go through that again. I don't.
But if you were a pharaoh, even if you were like a mean, nasty Hitler-like pharaoh, they would still bury you with the same reverence. And you're saying that he wouldn't get to go to heaven or take the barge to the other side.
It might be do-over.
You have to. Also, he would have to get reincarnated, maybe.
Yeah, but they did do curses for pharaohs that they didn't like. For example, they really didn't like Hatshepsut because she stayed in power too long when she should have let her nephew take over, Thutmose IV. She was co-regent with him when he was a boy, and then she just kind of did it for a long time, and he became a man. And, suddenly when she dies, she's buried, but for a long time we did not know where she was buried. There were mummies whose heads had been taken off. So obviously everything that they had done to preserve these particular mummies, was somebody had destroyed it. They have found what they think is Queen Hatshepsut, and she was taken out of her tomb, wrapped up, put in another cache, unmarked. No sort of spells or religious text around her. She's just was in this cache. Relatively unknown, and the only way they could identify her was through DNA. And that was how they figured out it was probably Hatshepsut.
Well, weren't there, her arms were crossed in a certain way. There were some other visual clues that kind of led them sort of to that belief, to at least go look at her DNA in the first place.
Yeah, I think there were some, the fact that when she was buried, not quickly, but well, with the 72-day process. that they usually took. And so the care was taken with the body in the burial process. But, afterwards, someone came in and, probably figured out where she was, or one of the people who was in her, in her group would have known that someone was coming after her and then took her out under darkness. I mean, that's a possibility too. We really don't know how it happens that she never ended up in her tomb. But that was not where she was found. Akhenaten was the same way.
Yeah, and I was going to bring his name up, and I just want to let you know we have like 4 minutes. This hour has just flown by.
Wow, it was fast. It was so fun talking to you.
So what are your thoughts on Akhenaten? Because he fascinates me. I think he's one of my favorites.
He's very interesting. I think that if you compare I believe it's Psalm 19 with the great hymn to Aten, you'll find a lot of similarities. So he has sometimes been thought to be the author of Psalm 19. Just kind of interesting. He was very much a one God person. But that didn't mean that he didn't see any of the other gods. He mostly saw that it was light that was, and so instead of worshiping one thing over another, it was a political thing. He was saying, it's the divine light. It's the divine energy. That's what I worship. So, and it really was to take the financial powers away from the high priest of Amun, that he moved to Tel El Amarna and honored Aten instead. Changed his name from Amun to Aten, Aten instead of Amun.
It just makes you wonder politically what it was like during that period of time. I mean, I'm sure there was tons of politics all the time going on, and different temples vying for power because this one has prestige, then this one has prestige. But when he just said, phooey to all of you and set up his own shop, it probably didn't go over real well.
No, I don't think it did. And so his name has been chiseled out and left out of almost every single king's list, because he, deigned to take away the power from the priests of Amun, who had ruled Karnak for thousands of years.
Do you have any thought on his dating? Because there are some people that say that, he's the one that inspired the Jewish people. And then there are other people that say, well, the Jewish people weren't there yet. And there's a whole bunch of controversy around, his role and the creation of monotheism. Any thoughts?
I think that he was a model for monotheism. I don't know that he was, I think he was a model. I don't know how much influence he had actually himself. Because what I hear, at least from the Egyptian Egyptologists that I talk with, they tend to think that Merenptah was more or less, who came after him, was more or less the pharaoh that Moses left. And he would have been the son of Ramses II.
But couldn't have, well, then let me ask, was he before the whole Moses thing? I mean, were the Jewish people in Egypt during his reign that they might have been influenced by?
They were in Egypt. And they have been in Egypt for, thousands of years before that. Since the Middle Kingdom, they were in Egypt. And there are pictures of, not pictures, what am I talking about? There are actual remains of archaeological sites where the Hebrews lived on the island of Elephantine, directly next to cities where the ancient Egyptians lived. So, there was a whole culture there, a temple of Yahweh, a temple of Khnum, side by side, sometimes in the Middle Kingdom era. And at the beginning of the early New Kingdom, but after Ramses, no, not so much.
Not so much. I'm looking at the clock, and the music's going to come up here in a second. So, Normandi, if somebody wants to get a copy of your book, what's the best place for them to do that?
Well, they can go to the internet on innertraditions.com, or they can buy my book. They can buy both of my books at a discount at hathorsmirror.com.
Do they come signed?
No, but
bummer.
If you come on a trip with me, I'll sign them.
Why are you going to Egypt for 2012? It seems like half the planet is.
Well, I'm going next month, in October, and I will go again September 2013. So please check my website, normandyellis.com.
All right. Normandi, thanks so much for coming on, but I have to go.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. And then let's see, next week we're going to be speaking to Lisa Romanek about her experiences with extraterrestrial contact, and Jay Wiedner about the moon landing conspiracy. So remember, a couple of weeks, we will be moving to Inception Radio Network. That's inceptionradionetwork.com. I will post a thing on Blog Talk to let you know what's going on. My new book, got the proof in the mail. It will be available in the next couple of weeks for you to purchase a copy, but you can pre-order at manmadethechronicles.com. And so I just want to thank all of you for letting me into your home today. And until next week, be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita.